This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and so grateful to have a place to talk about faith and politics and big ideas in our culture with all kinds of interesting, accomplished folks of goodwill in good faith. And it is an honor to announce that our program is part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Please remember to subscribe, tell a friend, give us a good rating, and leave a review. All of that helps to get us discovered in all the different apps and all that good stuff. So the easiest way to find us is our main site, which is www.politicsandreligion.us. It's www.politicsandreligion.us, or feel free to connect with me on all the social media apps at Corey S. Nathan. That's at Corey, S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan. All of that helps get the word out so more people can participate in the conversation like the one we're having today with Stephen Forrester Hayes. Steve Hayes is CEO and editor of The Dispatch, one of my favorite media outlets. The Dispatch provides fact-based reporting and commentary on politics, policy, and culture, informed by conservative principles. Prior to The Dispatch, Steve succeeded friend of the pod, Bill Kristol, as editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard. Steve was also a senior writer for National Journal's Hotline and served as director of the Institute on Political Journalism at Georgetown University for 6 years. He's written for such publications as the LA Times, the New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, National Review, and Reason. And he's been a commentator and appeared on such television shows as The Today Show, Meet the Press, CNN, Fox News Channel, MSNBC, CNBC, C-SPAN, and today he's on TPNR. So before we get, thanks for coming in, by the way. How are you doing, Steve?
Yeah, happy to be here. I'm doing well, thanks. Great to be here.
Awesome. I'm so appreciative for you taking the time. But before we get into, we'll get into plenty of politics, but before we get into any of that stuff, unlike Jonah Goldberg, we have no ban on wide-ranging discussions of Spanish wine. So
that's good. I'm happy to go wherever you lead me on that.
Okay. Any recommendations?
I mean, I might have splurged for a bottle of good Spanish red wine last night, actually. There wasn't any special occasion, but there's a Toro. It's a big, bold red called Pintia, Pintia, and it's one of my favorites. When I lived in Madrid a few years ago, I think I could get it for $40-ish in Madrid, which was a splurge. But here in the U.S., you're paying close to 100 for it. So it was a real treat. Okay. But it's my favorite. Big, bold reds. That's what I like.
You know, it's funny you say that because when folks ask me what my favorite type of wine, I just say obvious reds.
Obvious reds. That's good.
Yeah. So we spent, one of my really good friends was a missionary in northern Spain in Pamplona region. So we spent a few different stints there with him, several weeks, and I fell in love. Sometimes we ventured out, and I found a couple of vineyards in the Navarra region, I guess that part of the country is called, and just really fell in love. It's hard to find, though. You really have to look. Anyway, we didn't come to talk about too much about that. So I was curious. It sounds like you started coming to conservative positions when you were still pretty young. So at what point did you begin to align that way, and how did you begin to form some of those views?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't know is the short answer to that. I have always, as long as I can remember, had an interest in politics, and I did not come from a family that was particularly political. So we were not the sort of proverbial sit around the dinner table and talk politics family. We talked about, our sports and school, and my dad was an adoption attorney, just recently retired. We'd talk about family stuff. We didn't talk about politics very much. And if I had to guess what my parents voted at the time, I would have said, slightly right-leaning, but pretty independent thinkers. I did not come out that way. I was pretty conservative pretty early. I think I had the tremendous advantage of growing up in the era of Ronald Reagan, and our politics then for people who were 18 20, 25 years old were just so different from our politics today. And I saw kind of the goodness of conservatism. So I was writing conservative columns for my campus newspaper. I came out after I graduated from undergrad and moved to Washington, D.C., took a job at the Heritage Foundation, another institution that's changed tremendously over the past few years, and I just couldn't get enough. I did some grad school in D.C. at night at Georgetown, and DC is a really, or was, maybe it's not really anymore. DC used to be a really rich place for somebody on kind of an intellectual adventure. And so I just couldn't get enough. I would go to lectures at the American Enterprise Institute and then go to another lecture at night at the Heritage Foundation. And the next morning I'd go to Cato and, go to university sponsored functions and read everything I could get my hands on. And it was a great place. So I'd say I was sort of instinctively conservative. And then the more I read, the more I believed in broadly in limited government.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Heritage writing. You edited that newsletter for the Heritage Foundation. That was your first job out of undergrad, right?
It was, right.
And did you know you wanted to go into journalism or specifically political journalism as a kid, or was that first job more happenstance because you were on this intellectual pursuit?
Yeah, I mean, I think my ideal, I loved writing in college and really in high school. I've sort of loved writing in ideas. So I think my ideal was to be a professional writer, but I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to do that. I mean, there weren't that many positions available. And, when I first moved to Washington and set up shop at the Heritage Foundation, I did a writing of a couple different varieties. I wrote this newsletter. It was a quarterly newsletter, went to a couple 100,000 Heritage Foundation members, but also did a lot of the writing, sort of ghostwriting for Ed Follner, who's the president of the Heritage Foundation at the time, wrote to small dollar donors, helped draft some grant proposals, things like that. And I guess basically I thought if I could write and do something in sort of the world of politics and ideas, that was the goal. Yeah, I mean, I grew up reading George Will. I used to read this thing called the Conservative Chronicle, which was a weekly sort of newspaper format publication delivered to my house. And it was a collection of all of the center right syndicated columnists in the country. So, and I would, literally wait at the mail slot for that to come. So I kind of couldn't get enough, and I just bathed myself in all of those ideas from the beginning.
Some kids are, waiting at the mailbox for the release of the new Topps baseball cards, but you
Yeah,
were waiting for.
I was. I mean, I was a dork, I guess, in that respect. I was an athlete in high school, was an athlete in college, and I was into baseball cards when I was younger. So I was the guy who was at the local drugstore picking up baseball cards in an earlier era. But yeah, the more I read, the more I wanted to read.
Oh man. So you were reading George Will, you were going to the seminars, and that was an interesting time too, 93, 94, because Gingrich's contract with America, do
Yeah,
I remember that right?
yeah,
So I remember listening to some of his talks and reading some essays that he wrote, Gingrich, at that time, and thinking these are compelling ideas. But then some of the rhetoric, it's the first time I became aware that the rhetoric was oppositional, was contentious,
yeah.
and I didn't have as warm of a response to the contentiousness of the rhetoric. Were you discerning between those two things, the style and the substance, or were you just kind of rooting it on, like, yeah, that's a good one?
Yeah, I mean, not certainly with the level of sophistication it sounds like you brought to it. I liked the contract with America and what Newt Gingrich was trying to do. I thought there was sort of an element of common sense, limited government common sense to it. And I thought it was sort of brilliant in its mass appeal. The highly charged rhetoric, it didn't stand out to me. And that may have been just my own ignorance about how sort of business was conducted in Washington in the years leading up to my arrival there. And to the extent that that I paid attention, it didn't bother me. It wouldn't have bothered me. I was sort of in it. I liked a pugilistic conservative style. I was sick of, decades of liberal governance in Washington, D.C. And I do think, it is the case. I mean, there's an element of the argument that some people in our modern era make about sort of the tendency of a Republican establishment to just go along to get along and not make sort of ideas-based arguments, and sometimes to line their own pockets. I bought that. I buy that critique today to a certain extent, and I bought that critique back then. So I was happy to have kind of an outsider making a more ideological argument. I was an ideological guy, and I didn't like the sort of first seeking compromise on everything that I thought some Republicans brought to their conduct of the government's business.
Yeah, it's interesting because I realize that the common engaged citizen forms their opinion about conservatism more from the outspoken characters like a Newt Gingrich or obviously a Rush Limbaugh, who is really beginning to emerge as a dominant player in the media landscape at that time. But the Thomas Sowells of the world aren't as widely read as Limbaugh, and then the whole industry that he spurned. Fox News was coming on the scene at that time. So our impressions are more, I think, shaped by the media personalities than by the serious thinkers that seem to have formed your impression of conservatism and how you arrived at certain views.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's certainly what you're describing is certainly the case today. In this era of performative politics, it is sort of the loudest voices that carry the day, and don't even at this point make arguments. I think the thing that was brilliant about Thomas Sowell is whether you agreed or disagreed with sort of ultimately his conclusions or the cases that he made on whether you're talking about economics, or race, or housing, or poverty, what have you, is there was an argument there, and you could spend time in the argument and ultimately determine whether he brought the evidence and made a persuasive case to bring you along. So much of our politics today is just argument free. It's sort of assertion after assertion after assertion. I mean, this is, I think, Donald Trump's, to the extent that we want to say he has a governing style. That's what Donald Trump does. He doesn't really stop and make arguments. I don't think he understands arguments. He doesn't care about arguments. He cares about power. So he just makes assertion after assertion after assertion. I mean, I took it all in at the time. I was a regular Rush Limbaugh listener. I worked landscaping for 3 summers for Milwaukee County and spent most of my time cutting grass or doing sort of maintenance at a series of pools around the county. And, I always had either a, old transistor radio, or we got Walkman, were the thing to have. And, I was constantly listening to that stuff. I listened to Rush Limbaugh from noon to 3, more days than not, particularly in the summer. I'd say that, when I was in college, I didn't do it as much, but I read all of that. And, I probably started with more media conservatives, talk radio types. I listened to Charlie Sykes from the Bulwark. I grew up in Milwaukee.
There you go.
Charlie was the king of Milwaukee, the time that I was sort of forming my politics. He was incredible. And I would listen to him. My folks came to listen to Charlie a lot. So I took it all in.
I love what you're doing with the Dispatch and your team is doing with the Dispatch, with Charlie, the space that Charlie and Sarah are carving out with the Bulwark. It gives me a sense of hope that independent media outlets are taking some space back. I heard you say in an interview before the official launch of the Dispatch, you were talking to Jonah actually on the Remnant. I was going to say the Ruminant, the Remnant. You said there are strong incentives in modern journalism to provide affirmation rather than information. And I had to check myself because I was listening to this interview recently. This was in, the summer of 2019. So how prescient was that? So given some of the recent revelations through the Dominion Fox News case, it struck me how clairvoyant that seemed to be. I'd love for you to expound on that here, but also, do you see things improving in media and journalism?
Well, part of the reason that I would say something like that in a discussion with Jonah was based on my own experiences. I had just come out of serving for a couple of years as the editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard, as you noted, taking over for Bill in January of 2017. And, I was reluctant to take the job. I turned down the job a number of times. And I was reluctant to take the job for a couple of reasons. One was the emergence of Donald Trump. Trump had just been elected. We had at the Weekly Standard taken a pretty strong editorial position against Donald Trump. We didn't think he was good for American politics. We didn't think he was likely to be a good president. Certainly wanted him to be, but our experience in covering him suggested that he would be the disaster that I think he was in many respects. And it was a hard time to be running a right-leaning magazine when in this era of extreme polarization where people do want their views just affirmed. It was pretty clear that we were going to be pushing back against those views. Now, there was a certain excitement to that. I mean, there's a real freedom to be able to make whatever the heck arguments you want to make without regard to who you piss off. And the Weekly Standard certainly was never a Republican partisan organization. I mean, at the launch in the mid 1990s, they took on Bob Dole, the Republican Congress, pushed in a number of different directions. So there's a history there. The second reason I was reluctant to take the job initially was the owners of the Weekly Standard also owned the Washington Examiner, and the business model that they employed at the Washington Examiner was sort of this volume scale-based outrage journalism. So take something that you read in the New York Times, find the thing that will piss off conservatives, rewrite it in 3 paragraphs, slap a clickbaity headline on it, and send it to Matt Drudge so that you can get a bunch of hits and monetize it. Now, I want to say that there are really good people doing really good work at the Washington Examiner as well, but that was primarily what they were doing. And I was worried that that's the direction they were pushing the Weekly Standard. They had been pushing the Weekly Standard. So I had conversations with the owner and the suits that sort of ran our business side and said, that's not the journalism I want to do. I don't want to just be in the business to piss people off. I want to be in the business to find people, to find things out, to push people, to challenge our assumptions, to challenge their assumptions. And while they told me that they didn't have any intention of pushing us in the sort of clickbaity affirmation journalism path, it was very clear that that's what they wanted to do. And that was, those tensions existed for the rest of the existence of the Weekly Standard. So that's a long way of saying, it may have seemed like the things I was saying were new, but it was born of that experience for sure. And I think we've seen many media outlets across the ideological spectrum practice this kind of affirmation journalism. I think it's one of the main things that's wrong with cable news. You read headlines, and this is not true just of political journalism either. There's a certain desire to be bold and controversial and make people angry so that people click in all kinds of journalism. I play fantasy football, and the thing that has perplexed me as a fantasy football guy over the past half dozen years, the prevalence of headlines promising a bold take. I mean, that's literally the headline. You come in here for this bold take from so-and-so writer. I don't want a bold take. I want an accurate take. Like, give me some numbers, back it up, make a case. Like, tell me how I should think about this stuff. I don't care about your bold take. Anybody can have a bold take. Usually the bolder the take, the less likely it is to be accurate. Yeah, there's been a lot of that, and it's been a quick slide down.
Yeah. It seems to me that if AI can challenge any type of journalism, that's the journalism it'll challenge, because you can write a catchy headline. I was looking, I think it might have been actually in your in the Dispatch. I was reading someone summarize a number of the headlines coming out of Tucker Carlson, and they were all very, very similar. Shocking, using certain words that tricked the algorithms. You've mentioned a couple times now when Trump came on the scene, and you're cautious, at first cautious, and then opposition to much of what he represented. There was a moment for me when I grew up in Jersey, so I knew this character way before he ever came on the political scene. I had friends of mine that I graduated high school with that worked on the Taj, building the Taj. They were contractors laying the cement in the parking lots or putting in the plumbing, and they were getting that 30 cents on the dollar, if that, type of negotiation after the fact from Trump. So a lot of us in Jersey knew who this character was,
Right.
let alone ruining the first version of the USFL. But there was a moment in 2015, prior to the 2016 election, where I thought, "Oh man, this guy's not going away." And it was when he said that thing about John McCain. He said, "I like my heroes who aren't captured." So you were actually there. I'm
I
so
was.
curious what that was like to be in that room. And did you? So I realized in the uh, in the 2012 cycle, there was one leading candidate after another. Herman Cain. He says, "Oh, shucky ducky," and he falls off a cliff in the polls.
Yeah.
But after that incident, he wasn't dropping in the polls the next day, the day after, the week after, and I thought, "Oh man,
Yeah.
this means trouble. This guy's not going away." What was it like being in that room? And you got to ask him a follow-up question. So, what was that? Describe that scene for me.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly an interesting moment for me. I was in Ames, Iowa, at Iowa State University. There's a very powerful Christian conservative named Bob Vander Plaats who runs an organization called Family Leader, and they have it's sort of a cattle call of presidential candidates in Iowa the 6 months before the Iowa caucuses at the beginning of the presidential year, and they sit on stage and they do these interviews. In this case, it was with Frank Luntz, the Republican pollster and sort of language maven. And yeah, I was in the balcony for this question to Trump about McCain, and he, everybody's familiar with what he said. So I like people who didn't get captured, and I was. Yeah, I'd gotten to know John McCain pretty well, covering the 2008 race. I was in New Hampshire with John McCain when after his campaign had collapsed, sort of preparing, spent a good week plus with him, sort of preparing to write, his political epitaph. And then it turned out it was the beginning of his revival. But I was, there were four of us driving around in a van for a week. It was a great experience. I got to know him a little bit. A lot I didn't agree with McCain on policy wise, but I thought he was a good man. And I was viscerally just angry to hear this from Donald Trump. I knew what John McCain did in Vietnam. I thought it was absolutely offensive that Trump would say something like that, particularly given Trump's own history. So I scampered down from the balcony. I mean, it was and it was a noticeable thing in the crowd. I mean, the audience gasped when Trump said this. So I went from the balcony down to this area where they were doing these press conferences, and I asked him a question about it. And I can't remember. It ended up being about a 10-minute shouting back and forth between me and Trump. I can't remember what my first question was, but at some point I asked him a direct question. I was reading from my notebook his exact words back to him. And all I said was, "Why would you say this?" And I really had never experienced anything quite like this in my time as a reporter. He just said, "I didn't." I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about McCain's poor work on Veterans Affairs issues. And so I read him his words. I said, no. This is what you said. And this is all being videoed. It was like, how could this guy possibly lie? Everybody saw what he said on stage. I'm reading him his exact words now, and he was just claiming, it's like the kid with the Oreos on his face. Like, he was just claiming that he hadn't eaten the Oreos. And I'm like, but you have Oreos all over your face. Like, it was a crazy moment. And I certainly thought it would damage, perhaps irretrievably, his campaign. That was the headline that my editors at the Weekly Standard put on the piece that I wrote. Thought it would end his campaign. But what was interesting is I came to talk to folks who were in his orbit after that and who were at his side at the time, and they too thought it was the end of his campaign. Everybody who was working with him, sort of at least on his Iowa team at the time, started preparing their resumes to send to other candidates, because not only was he saying this thing that was untrue about a former Republican nominee, even if John McCain wasn't likely to be a favorite of Republican primary voters in Iowa, he was also picking this fight with a guy who's on Fox News a lot. Now, I don't claim to be I wasn't a big deal at Fox at the time, but I was on Fox 3-4 days a week at the time. And, they thought that was really bad form. But as you say, it not only didn't hurt him, I think in some respects, that incident and others that we would see over the subsequent year and a half are part of the reasons that he was popular, because he was willing to take on anybody on anything, and sort of in that aggressive, in your face way that we came to know as kind of Donald Trump's signature style.
Yeah, I've been trying to diagnose now for almost 8 years why that's the case. What is it in our culture? What is it in our political discourse that paved the way for someone like this? Especially folks I go to church with. We know the fruit of the spirit. We know good Christian virtues, and he is the exact opposite of that. And the only thing I could diagnose, the only conclusion I could come to, they actually articulated in the 2020 campaign, he's fighting for us. That there was
Right.
this spirit that had built up over decades, that folks felt like they weren't seen, they weren't heard, that there was an enemy, a political adversary that needed to be fought against. So anything was on the table, any sort of anti-virtue, if you will, was okay if
Yeah,
he's fighting for us.
I think that's right. You know, I said earlier, part of, I was running a journalism program at Georgetown at the time, and going to grad school. So I wasn't actively involved in politics or journalism at the time of the Newt Gingrich election. But I said before, to the extent that I was pretty sympathetic to the argument that Republicans should fight a little bit here, like throw a punch, like get in an argument, make a case. And certainly, if that's how I felt in 1994, you fast forward to the Tea Party era, and I was pretty sympathetic with what the Tea Party was trying to do. In my mind, that was, a movement that was based on, I thought at the time, a desire to limit government and a concern about debt and deficits. And that's where I was in 1994. That's where I was in 2010. It's where I am today. I think in retrospect, a bigger part of the appeal of the Tea Party for many sort of Republican base voters was less about the policy stuff that I cared so much about, and much more about, oh, thank God somebody's fighting. They're taking it to Barack Obama. We're sick of this Obamacare. We don't like the spending, the stimulus package. We're taking it to Barack Obama. And the moment where I think that became sort of obvious and undeniable for me, and I don't know if you remember this, but was the Stand with Rand moment on the Senate floor, where Rand Paul had gotten into this back and forth with Attorney General Eric Holder about whether the U.S. government had the right to drone its own citizens. And I mean, the theoretical that was bandied about at the time was whether a U.S. citizen could be droned in a Starbucks. And, I don't think anybody really thought that the U.S. government was going to drone one of its own citizens in a Starbucks. It just wasn't a big concern. But Rand Paul does this actual filibuster as opposed to the sort of fake filibuster, goes to the Senate floor, speaks forever. And this was something that took place on Twitter as a sort of a social media moment that probably wouldn't have been possible 15 years earlier. You start seeing hashtag Stand with Rand, and then Ted Cruz goes down to the Senate floor, and then other Republicans follow down to the floor, and it becomes this huge thing. And I remember watching it unfold in real time and thinking, like, are people really worried about ordering a caramel macchiato and having their head blasted? And I don't think that was the case. I think it was just, this was somebody frontally and aggressively taking on Barack Obama in a way that Republicans really hadn't done. And I think it sort of catalyzed conservatives in a certain way. After that, you saw the government shutdown in 2014. The Stand with Rand thing was 2013. And you saw conservatives take a much more aggressive kind of consequences be damned attitude to fighting. And fighting became sort of the coin of the realm.
Yeah, and certainly in McCain's, one of his big decisions obviously was picking Sarah Palin. The
Right.
what was the comparison she made? What's the difference between a hockey mom and a bulldog? Lipstick.
Yeah,
She was
yeah.
certainly the fighter. I wasn't a big fan of Sarah Palin, partly for that same reason I was talking about Gingrich before, because I didn't see the substance. I
Yeah.
saw the facade, if you will, and I thought, man, she's talking about folks that are my friends, my family. That's not who they are. and stealing words, stealing great words like patriot. All of a sudden, patriot is only the domain of the right. I didn't like that style of politics. I was much bigger fan of the Tip O'Neill, Ronald Reagan days, when they'd have robust debates. And then, at 6 o'clock, they'd pour some scotch and be pals.
It's so interesting to hear you say that. I mean, I'm where you are now. I'm not sure I was where you are now back then. I mean, I remember being pretty defensive about Sarah Palin. I had done a lot of reporting about her possible selection. I knew the people who were involved in those discussions, and I liked what I thought she represented in a certain way, and I totally bought that she was treated with really regrettable condescension right away. I think if I'm being honest about it, I look back on that, it turns out that some of that condescension probably was unproductive, was counterproductive. Skepticism was called for, and I probably had a blind spot on some of that because I'm so accustomed to. I mean, I buy the argument that media certainly lean left and have not covered Republicans well over the years. I think there's a reason that all of Newt Gingrich and Donald Trump's complaints about the mainstream media resonate as much as they do. And it's not just whining. I think there's a substance there. I think it was a problem for years. And I thought she was a victim of some of that coverage. But in retrospect, I was probably more defensive of her than she deserved. I mean, I wouldn't have called myself a fan, and I was critical in many ways, but I was sort of receptive to arguments that said she was being mistreated.
If you could, looking back at your time, say between when you arrived in DC, 93, if you could have a political mulligan, either for yourself or the conservative movement between 93 and when you were fresh out of college and 2015, everything leading up to the Trump era, would you have any? If so, what would it be?
Man, that's a great question. A political mulligan, something that didn't play well for politics. I mean, I think I would probably point to, honestly, sort of anything and everything that led to this current moment, right? That led to the election of Donald Trump. So, pick your factors there. I don't know on a political side if there's anything in particular that I would jump on into 2015. I think the government shutdown was regrettable in 2014. And while Republicans didn't pay for it the way that I think many people thought they would pay for it politically at that time, I think it cemented in people's minds that there was a nihilism to some of what Republicans were doing. At the time, I didn't oppose them because I thought there was a utility in making clear that Barack Obama continued to own Obamacare. I didn't think it was going well. And so while it was the case that the Republicans were never going to actually win that fight, Barack Obama was never going to repeal Obamacare, I thought there was a utility in making clear for voters, hey, this is his. Republicans are opposed to it. But the sort of shutdown and the failure to have a solution, a policy alternative, I think was a bad moment that continued to haunt Republicans. And that was also, I would say, I mean, collectively, the things that have led to this moment of performative politics where people don't really care, certainly many members of Congress, they just don't care that much about legislation that's passed and about governing. They care about, having a blog praise them or doing a podcast on their own or going on Fox News and being praised by Fox News personalities. I think those are the things that have led us to a really bad point in American politics right now.
Man, you're depressing me, man.
I'm sorry.
There are no Paul Ryans left in Congress. But our own congressman, Mike Garcia, this is I'm in California 27, a very, very purple district. He only won by 333 votes in the 2020 cycle.
Right.
Which is less than 1/10 of 1% of the 340,000 that voted that cycle. but he doesn't seem to govern or participate in legislation. You know, if you read his Twitter feed or you look at his Fox News hits or his Newsmax hits, he seems to only be playing to the most extreme fringe of his current party, and I find it regrettable. I wish we had a wonk. You know, I think that a real political junkie could persuade some of the folks who are to his left, and that's the district that we're in. So it is really regrettable. You know, but that ties into another question I had about the when you started the Dispatch. So take me back to say 2018, 2019. What did you see in the marketplace and the culture that that inspired you to launch this independent media outlet? Were there certain needs or gaps that you were seeing as opportunities to fill?
Yeah, I think there were. I mean, in part, this was what we were trying to do with the Weekly Standard for its last couple of years. You know, if you looked at what was happening on the right or center right in conservative media, I think people understood that politicians wanted to perform, that the more they could sell outrage, the more hits they would get, the more money they could make conceivably. And I thought at the Weekly Standard, basically just by being true to the principles that guided the Weekly Standard from its founding, we could kind of stand astride that and oppose it and sort of lean back into facts. So we hired a number of new reporters, people who had come from the Charlotte Observer, people who had come from sort of traditional journalistic backgrounds to help fortify our fact-based coverage. And then, you know, we had some of the best magazine writers, opinion writers, narrative long form writers in the entire country at the Weekly Standard. So we tried to do that at the Weekly Standard, and in my view, it was working. Now, the owners will tell a different story. I'm not sure that their story is entirely accurate, but numbers suggest that it was working, and it was just this misalignment between their wanting to play the volume scale game, and you know, my view was you're much better off monetizing subscriptions and growing your subscriber base. That's more stable foundation for growth, but it's hard. It doesn't scale as well as they wanted to. So when I talked to Jonah Goldberg for the first time about doing this is what we talked about. We said, look, this is there's certainly bright spots in places in the conservative media, and there are individuals, maybe publications I can point to and say, these are people who are doing a great, great job. But it was definitely the case. I think it's still the case that what you've seen in terms of trends on the center right has been this drift toward anger and exaggeration, outrage, and in many cases, just outright fabrication. You've got popular media outlets that just publish bullshit, like it's false stuff. I mean, obviously, we've seen this with what Fox News was doing. That's the most obvious and recent example. But we thought that that we could create a place where inquiry was actually sort of at the heart of the business, reporting facts, where people could come with different points of view and learn something, actually deepen their understanding of a topic. So we do, probably half or more than half of what we do at the Weekly Standard is one version or another of explanatory journalism, where we say, hey, this is interesting. How can we learn more about it? And that all starts with reporting and facts. So we kind of doubled and tripled down. We did see, if you think of the media landscape as an ideological spectrum, and you start in the center and you move to the left. I've talked about this before. Start in the center and you move to the left. Our view is that is a very densely populated part of the landscape. If you start in the center and you move to the right, there's a big hole in the center right. And at the same time, when we were talking to possible investors and sort of coming up with the ideas to launch this thing, we said, if you start in the center and you move to the left and you ask the people running those outlets what they're doing, virtually every one of them will say reporting in the very first sentence of their answer. And if you start in the center and you move to the right and you ask people, what are you doing? Virtually none of the people running those outlets will say reporting in the first sentence of their answer. And we thought that was a big opening for us. It turns out to have been a much bigger opening than we could have possibly imagined, in a way that I think is encouraging, not just for the Dispatch, but for the country and for our discourse. But that was the idea. That's why we did it.
Yeah. Yeah, I have so many questions now. So one that has come up a couple times now, once you started writing critiques of Trump and Trumpism, once you became aware of that, I would imagine within you developed friendships and you had colleagues in conservative circles that were pushing back. What kind of pushback did you get? Did you lose friendships? What was that like for you as you started becoming more vocal and public in your concerns about Trumpism?
Yeah, I mean, initially, I would say virtually everybody in my world shared my concerns about
Mhm.
Trump and Trumpism. And a lot of those people were making those arguments publicly. But as it became clearer and clearer that Trump was likely to win the Republican nomination in 2016, and then certainly when he won the presidency in 2016, you just saw people flip sort of en masse. And a number of these were people that I had conversations with, public, big name people I'd had conversations with in mid-October of 2016. This one person who's very carefully or often described as a Trump intellectual talked to me openly about how he couldn't wait for the election to be over so he wouldn't have to keep making arguments that he didn't believe to defend Donald Trump. And
Wow.
there was no sort of guile about it. It was just like this was how it was. He had to do it, but Hillary was going to win. Then he could go back and be sort of in the opposition and get back to arguments that he was comfortable making. And lo and behold, Trump wins, and this guy goes on and will defend anything and everything that Donald Trump has ever said or done. And Jonah Goldberg, my co-founder, has talked about this as well. But I mean, it wasn't uncommon to be on a panel at Fox where you would do a debate or a discussion, and at the end of the discussion, if we didn't have to go out of our way to criticize things that Donald Trump did. I mean, he did something almost every day that was
Almost
sort
every
of
day. Yeah.
outrageous by the standards of human behavior. And so we would make what I continue to believe are sort of the obvious critiques, like, oh no, you shouldn't call a woman horse face.
Right.
And you'd have these other people, including people who wrote books about virtue and women who had criticized Trump in the past, say, well, in fact, her face really is long and horses' faces are
Oh,
long. And, I mean, you just would and you just think, what are you talking about? But then the cameras, the lights would turn off and they would say, oh, I'm so sick of having to make these arguments. And my response always was, you don't have to make these arguments. And I think it was a real disservice to Fox's viewers because it created this impression that everybody was on board with Donald Trump, except for a few of us, finger wagging holdouts. When in reality, most people were not on board with that. They just went along because they thought they had to, either for career reasons or what have you.
I forget off the top of my head when exactly you and Jonah very publicly tapped out of Fox News. Was it the Patriot Purge? Was that the?
It was, yeah. It was
Yeah.
November of 2021.
I was surprised that it took that long, frankly. So was that the breaking point, or were you? Did you feel like the frog in the boiling pot?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long and complicated answer, and I'll try to keep it reasonably short. I mean, being at Fox through 2015, it was fun. We had a good time. Certainly there were moments of excess. I had done a lot of reporting on Benghazi for the Weekly Standard. I think it was a scandal. I think senior Obama administration officials lied. I think they should have gotten in trouble for it. That said, I would watch some of the coverage at Fox and think, what are these people talking about? Like, I've done all this reporting on the facts. Like, these conspiracies they're floating are just not true. Like,
Right.
why is this happening? So, you're aware of that. And I probably was too quick to shrug off some of those excesses. Although when I talked about it on air, I would sometimes point them out. I would say, no, I don't think that stuff is true. Here's what's true. Then, after sort of the arrival of Donald Trump, it just was less fun to be at Fox. And I was increasingly concerned, and Joe and I know was too, at the ways in which particularly people on primetime at Fox were, as I just described, defending his indefensible positions, sometimes repeating and rationalizing the lies that he told. He told a lot of lies, and sometimes lying on his behalf, even when we knew that they didn't believe it. So, my approach to working at Fox from the beginning was keep your head down, work as hard as you can, do your best, don't get involved in the politics, don't worry about anything. And I stuck to that for most of my time at Fox. But as these incidents were sort of, as the frequency of these incidents increased, it's sort of unavoidable. You'd see something, I wasn't typically watching a lot of Fox shows, but something would cross my Twitter feed that Lou Dobbs said, and you just think, that's just not true. Or something that was part of Tucker's monologue, and you think, I can't believe he had this guy who's white nationalist adjacent on his show. And so I let my views be known inside of Fox with increasing regularity. I think they came to regard me as sort of a pain in the ass, and just like, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be doing this. And there was thought about leaving earlier. I can't remember exactly when I re-upped my contract, but it was at some point in 2020, and I was pretty sure before that I was going to leave. Both Jonah and I had lots of conversations with senior people at Fox who said, look, this is all going to change. Trump is going to eventually go away. And everybody at the network recognizes that we need to get back to sort of news and reporting, and that this is not sustainable. And I think the people who made those arguments to us totally believed them. I believe they were completely sincere. I think that's where they thought the network was going. And they were persuasive. So they kept us on. The other argument we heard that was not quite as compelling, because we just weren't on very often, but we had people, including lots of Trump skeptics, who said, you guys shouldn't quit, because when you're on, even if it's not very often, you can push back on some of this stuff. So rather than have a conspiracy be floated and just go unchallenged, typically we would challenge it. But that wasn't, as I say, that wasn't entirely compelling, because we weren't on very often. And even when we were on, mostly we were asked questions or pushed to talk about Joe Biden and things that Joe Biden was doing wrong. We were, it was very obvious that the Fox viewers did not want to hear us criticizing Donald Trump. And Fox producers knew that, Fox hosts knew that. And so we weren't very often asked to come on and talk about Donald Trump. So we stayed and tried with our little resistance faction inside to affect what change we could. And I think Patriot Purge was the point for both of us where we said, we're just totally deluding ourselves if we think this is going to change. And it gave us, I'd say, sort of hard evidence that was the case, because we saw the trailer. Trailer was, 3 minutes long, and it included a number of claims that were demonstrably false and deeply irresponsible. The U.S. government is bringing its helicopters back from Afghanistan to go after half of the country in what is the war on terror too, but it's the war on terror on Trump voters. And I'm paraphrasing there, but that's very close to the actual language. None of that was happening. That just wasn't happening. And, we made it very clear inside of Fox, we know this isn't happening. This shouldn't air. We shouldn't be party to this. This is irresponsible. And I think it's going to, if I believed what was being said there, I would be a revolutionary. I would be somebody to say, we can't let the government do this. And I thought then, and continue to believe, that is really dangerous, that the likelihood that we're going to see political violence come out of that kind of lying is real and probably increasing. And, we made those views well known inside of Fox and hoped that they would not air the show, and they aired the show. And at that point, there wasn't a close call. Obviously we had to go.
So do you read the firing of Tucker Carlson, and then a couple days before that of a host like Dan Bongino, as that someone like Paul Ryan's being more persuasive in the boardroom, or do you think it's purely a bottom line driven calculation?
I mean, I think it's probably neither of those exclusively. I think I don't know much about the story of Dan Bongino, but I know he'd been sort of agitating internally and pissing people off for a while. So I don't know that I tie that to the Dominion suit. Uh, I think there's an editorial component to Tucker's dismissal. There was, and I think Patriot Purge played a role in that. There were senior people at Fox who were surprised by the contents of Patriot Purge, who didn't know it was coming and then saw it and couldn't believe what it was. And I think there was a serious, if short discussion about killing it and not having it air, that it was something that Fox didn't want to be involved in, that it was too far. And ultimately, the decision was made that they couldn't shut down Tucker, and a lot of work had gone into this thing, and they didn't want to be on the other side. Tucker, I think if they had tried to kill it, strong likelihood that Tucker would have left. And I think that was sort of a moment for some of the executives at Fox to say, like, okay, we've let this guy and other primetime hosts basically run unsupervised now for a while, and it's too big. Like, we have no control. We've lost the ability to control. And I think that was, it was sort of one of those things that was, everybody knew was the reality all along, but that was a moment where it was unavoidable. Like, oh, okay, we're not in control here anymore. And I do think, and I think, on the flip side of that, it also told Tucker, like, you can create something that's huge elements of it are just not true, and you're good. Like, they're going to let you do it. And so I think that was part of sort of the editorial calculation. I don't have any real personal inside information. I mean, I'm still talking to people there pretty regularly, but I think these lawsuits played a role. I don't really buy the story that it was Tucker's sort of salty text messages that ended his time there. I mean, I do think it would be sort of understandable if Fox executives really weren't familiar with what was in Tucker's text messages and deposition, and were in fact surprised by that they would say, oh, this is problematic to put in front of a jury. But if they didn't know, if Fox executives didn't know what was in Tucker's deposition and Tucker's text messages, that means that they weren't briefed by the lawyers. I find that so hard to believe. It would be one of the worst cases of legal malpractice I can possibly imagine. Bad lawyering. So I have a hard time kind of believing that. I think it's really a combination of a bunch of factors. And we haven't heard Tucker's side. I don't know what he's going to say, but there have been sort of it's Jack Schaefer from Politico had a piece yesterday about how basically everything we know comes from anonymous leaks on both sides, which makes you just have little confidence that you really know what happened.
Right. I guess some of my questions are the desire to be optimistic about something, the desire to be optimistic that the Dispatch at some point will have a much more prominent voice in our culture than Fox News. I'm sure you share that hope.
I mean, I share the hope, and like I said, I mean, and this is not forced optimism. I mean, I'm down about a lot of things in our politics, as you can no doubt tell, but we didn't think that we would grow as fast as we've grown. And, we've got almost 40,000 people as paying members of the Dispatch, and I think approaching 250,000 people who are on our email lists, people who have said, I want a different kind of journalism.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly, and almost all that, I should say, until really the past 2-3 months, almost all that was organic growth. So we weren't really doing much in paid marketing side, mostly because I'm clueless about all that. And that's really encouraging. I mean, I think people who have come and spent time with us and taken on our work give us that feedback all the time. And that is like, there are all sorts of surprises when you do a startup and you're almost 50 years old. But I've been so pleasantly surprised that the impact that we are told that the work has had on sort of individuals' lives has been really great.
So I want to be mindful of time. I have pages and pages of questions, but I need to start landing this plane. So one thing I got to ask you. So, as you launched this incredibly successful media company, what advice do you have for guys like me, indie podcast producers? Anything, any words of wisdom that we could achieve maybe 1/10 of 1% of your audience's reach?
Well, I would say you're already doing the most important thing, was just do it regularly, right? Do it
Yeah.
regularly, have good guests, and be engaging. And your stuff. I told you before we started recording, I was listening to your interview with Will Salatin. It was one of the best interviews, one of the best discussions I've heard about American politics and political journalism in the past decade. It was just fantastic. And the more that you're doing that, then people will hear it, and the more they'll come. I think part of the challenge for people who are they're launching a Substack or an indie podcast is they over the course of a weekend, as they're brainstorming about what they want to do, they have all of the enthusiasm of a recent college grad, and they're ready to take on the world and do it all. And then life intervenes, right? It's not that easy to. Obviously, you do a lot of preparation for your podcast. You spend a lot of time going back. I mean, you were throwing quotes at Will from articles that he published in like 2002. You've done the same thing with me. So you obviously spend a lot of time preparing. That takes an investment, and you have to be serious about it. So just to be doing it on the regular, the way that you're doing it, and then to put out something engaging, like that's the first and most important thing to do. We also, to Dispatch, we had advantages. We were, as we discussed, we were on Fox regularly. Now, a lot of the Fox audience didn't like us as much as they perhaps once did. But Sarah Isker, who joined us, and is great, as you know, is on ABC News. Now I'm at NBC News. So we have sort of reach. People are seeing the Dispatch name in a way that gives us kind of an unfair advantage over other independent media outlets. But I think just doing the work, showing up and doing the work, and staying true to your mission. We wrote this thing, we published this thing on the first day we launched. Internally, we call it the manifesto, and I don't know, it's like a 3-page thing, and we titled it very creatively, "What Are We Doing?" And it just laid out what we were doing. And at the time, I think if you talk to Jonah about it, and our third co-founder, Toby Stock, we just thought it was important to explain kind of what the thing was. People, there have been articles written about that this thing is going to be launched, and we just wanted people to know, hey, this is what we're doing. There was a very utilitarian purpose in drafting and publishing that. But 3.5 years in, its great import, I think, to us is providing public constraints on how we operate. Because we made a promise in the first thing that we published that we were not going to be an outlet that provided affirmation over information. So if there's ever a temptation to do that, or somebody can say, look, I'm going to give you X amount of dollars to run this ad, and it's an affirmation play, we know that we'll be held accountable because we made this all public. And we have a number of things in that first document that turn out to have been important, not just as an explanation of what we were trying to do, but in keeping us sort of focused on our mission as we've gone.
Yeah. So speaking of mission, I got to ask you a question about our mission. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, or nurture relationships even with people across our differences, people who think differently than we do, who have different beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do? How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other?
Yeah, I mean, I love the title, and I love the approach. I mean, it's in the intro. This will sound like a horribly cliche answer, and I'm afraid it's true. I mean, I believe this, so deeply believe this. Do it. Like, have the conversations. Don't be afraid to have the conversations. I think so many people assume things about people that they imagine to be on the other side that are just not true. There's a fantastic book, actually, it's up on my bookshelf, called Collective Illusions by an author named Todd Rose. If you haven't had him, you should call him. He would be fantastic for this. He's put together.
You're the third person who's recommended Todd Rose in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, he's phenomenal. I would say, like, you don't often read books that sort of change your frame on things. And He did. He's got decades worth of research on our misapprehensions about people who are ostensibly on the other side of political issues. And we're all closer on these issues than we imagine we are. And we're closer than we're told we are by the people who are invested in keeping us apart. So whether it's Fox News or a lefty progressive outlet that's the alternative, what have you, they make money the more people are angry, the more people hate each other, and I think the more people misunderstand each other. So the very most important thing you can do is have the conversations, talk to people about it. Don't make assumptions about what people believe. Ask them what they believe and try to learn something. I mean, this shouldn't be sort of revolutionary, but like don't enter these kinds of conversations with the goal of impressing upon them the fact that you already have the answers.
Yeah.
So often as not, we don't have the answers.
I think that's a great point because I think a lot of folks might only know you as the guy who had unparalleled access and wrote the authoritative biography on Darth Vader and just come to all kinds of assumptions about you, but hopefully hearing, the human behind
Probably
the
true.
writer.
Undoubtedly true.
So for those who don't know, what I'm referring to is I was fascinated at what kind of access you were given. I do want to wrap up real quick, but Steve wrote a book, came out in 2009, Cheney, The Untold Story of America's Most Powerful and Controversial Vice President. I was fascinated by how, like I said, just unparalleled access. How did you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I pitched him on cooperating with the book and giving me that access in 2004. And I was very clear that it was going to be a reported book. I said, I want to write a book. I want to research the hell out of it. I want to do a ton of reporting. This is not going to be a hagiography. This is not going to be a book that's designed to burnish your vice presidency or your political career. And there'll be stuff in there you don't like. And there was definitely stuff in there that he didn't like. But I came pretty sympathetic to him politically. I agreed on him far more often than I disagreed, and my pitch was basically like, I'm your best bet for a fair shake. If you engage with me, I'm not going to do sort of gotcha journalism. There's not going to be there won't be cheap shots strewn throughout this book. I will talk to you as much as you will talk to me, and we'll have a conversation about your life, your politics, your career, and I'll write it. And that's what I did. And it was a tremendously rewarding experience just for the access, as you say, and the opportunity to have, that kind of back and forth. We had a lot of arguments over the course of the reporting of the book and some of the interviews, particularly about how he interacted with the media. But it was a terrific experience. If I had to do it again, I only spent, I think, 3 years working on it, writing it, but I would want to do it in 10 because there's just so much to get at. But I enjoyed
Oh, yeah.
it.
And if there is a follow, you said at one point in the book that, and the story's still being told or something like, oh, is there a story still being told? His last couple of years. So
Yeah.
I'd be interested if there was any follow up to that book.
Yeah. We ended up having to publish it in 2007.
Oh,
They were my publisher, HarperCollins, was trying to beat out a book that ended up not being published, or they thought they were trying to beat out a book that ended up not being published. So I would have liked to have waited till the end of the Bush administration. And there were things that came out in the last year and a half that I just don't really appear in my book much because they came out after that. But yeah, it was a really tremendous experience. I enjoyed that, and I was privy to a lot of stuff I never thought a kid from Wauwatosa, Wisconsin would get to see up close.
you must have been pinching yourself at different points, like sitting with the vice
For
president,
sure.
Okay, last couple questions. Do you have any questions for me?
Yeah. What was the main inspiration for doing this? Like, there's got to be, and you've probably told this on the podcast before, so I'll ask your listeners to bear with us, but you don't do something like this unless it's a mission driven podcast. Like you're trying to do something, you're trying to prove something. Why are you doing it?
I find myself straddling very different worlds, and I don't feel comfortable in any of them.
Mm.
I grew up in an observant Jewish household. We went to an Orthodox synagogue. when I became a Christian in my late 20s, as you can imagine, I had to have some very difficult conversations about religion with my father in particular, but others in my family and people I grew up with. Then, when I started going to church, I realized that what brought me to those convictions aren't necessarily what primarily defined the community that I was a part of.
Hmm.
I was really moved by Rabbi Jesus, Yeshua ben Yosef, and the theological convictions that I had arrived at through the Sermon on the Mount. And what I realized was that community, the church that I was a part of, couldn't be primarily defined by those same convictions, but by political and social positions. And especially when those two things were at odds, I relied on scripture, and there were a priori positions that were stuck to. So I had to have very difficult conversations in my. I've been kicked out of a few Bible studies
Hmm.
by having the temerity to say, "Hey guys, let's read what it says here in
Yeah.
this book called the Bible." And I just thought, for years I thought, man, this really is a primary problem in our culture. Let's have these conversations and let's do it better. Let's
Yeah.
not assume, well, like you were saying before, let's not assume, do this mental chain of like, oh, he has a Obama sticker, he must be this, this, and this, or he voted for Romney and Ryan, he must be X, Y, and Z. I just wanted to have these, do it better, and reclaim just a little bit of space in the public square. That's the motivating factor for me.
Yeah. Well, it seems like it's working. And
Thank you.
it, my previous answer about what we can all do was not meant to be a plug for your podcast, but it is. I mean, like I think it's the most important thing you can do. Have these conversations in a sort of respectful way and see what you can learn.
So, how can we find you online? How can we find the Dispatch and all the great work that you and your team are doing?
Yeah, the Dispatch is just thedispatch.com. That's probably the best place to go. I host with Sarah Isker. I don't really host it as much anymore. She does most of it. A podcast called the Dispatch Podcast. We do an interview podcast once a week and a roundtable discussion at the end of the week that we have a lot of fun with. That's another place. So find us on your podcast channels and subscribe. I guess I can point you to my Twitter account. I don't do much on Twitter. These days, I'm pretty disgusted with Twitter and social media in general. It's at Stephen F. Hayes is my Twitter account. And
Terrific.
I usually just promote Dispatch stuff. Yeah.
The F for Forrester, for Grace Forrester. I read a little bit about her. She was an inspiration, wasn't she?
She sure was. She's
Yeah.
my grandma. She was amazing.
Yeah. So before we go, is there anything important I forgot to ask you?
No, this was great. Very comprehensive. As I say, it's sort of obvious you've done your homework. So I
Oh,
appreciate the
man.
discussion.
Thanks so much, Steve. I really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
sorry again to be a pain getting this set up, but I'm glad we made it happen, and this was a lot of fun.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Thanks again.
Take care.
As always, if you dig what we're doing here, please hit that subscribe button, leave a review and comments wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend about TPNR. We're easier to recommend than ever. It's politicsandreligion.us. That's www.politicsandreligion.us. Or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey with an E and S as in Sam, at Corey S. Nathan. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.